It is August 26, 2025, and President Trump is now claiming that we need to take the Department of Defense back to being named the Department of War. And that's pretty fitting, given the fact that despite all of his claims about making peace around the world, he's actually doing the exact opposite, right? We have the US continuing to support the ongoing proxy war against Russia, showing no signs of slowing down, even if they're trying to hand the responsibility over to Europe. And on top of that, the US is also continuing with full support for the ongoing genocide of the Palestinians. Oh, and they're planning war against China. They're planning even more war against Iran. They're sending warships off the coast of Venezuela. And the list just goes on and on. And on top of that, you also have the Trump administration saying that they are looking at the US government taking stock in defense contractors. No, that's not a joke. They literally want to be even more invested than they already are in more and more endless war. So, what does this mean for US foreign policy and for the American people? Well, we got into all of the latest with a special guest earlier. So, let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Daniel McAdams, Executive Director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity and co-host of the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Daniel, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thanks for having me back on your show, Rachel.
Yeah, it's always good to talk to you. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here, as President Trump notably told reporters on Monday that the U.S. is no longer directly funding Ukraine, but is instead planning to sell weapons to Europe, which will then be given to Kiev through NATO. So, how do you view this hands-off approach that Trump is trying to take as he attempts to play third-party mediator in a war that the U.S. is still very much directly involved in?
Well, I found myself wondering, gosh, I wonder who funds NATO. Let me look. So I did a couple of searches, and the U.S. funds like 78% of NATO. So it's a distinction without a difference. The U.S. funds NATO, and NATO buys weapons for Ukraine. So he can say we don't directly fund, but we indirectly fund. And that's a problem because Trump has this entire time. I mean, he had the right instincts when he started. He said, "This is not my war. This is Biden's war." He could have just ended it right then and there. So I'm not going to have anything to do with it. I'm going to focus on America first. That's what got me elected. But he wasn't able. I mean, something must happen to people when they go into the White House, go into the Oval Office. There must be something in the air that they sniff that transforms them into a wannabe Caesar or something, because all of a sudden he just couldn't let it go. And he wanted to be mediator, but you can't be mediator if you're arming one side in a conflict. That's just basic common sense. I'm sure kids on a playground understand that. So it's a problem of not understanding why there's a war happening, and it's a problem of misreading your role as a mediator, and that's why the war hasn't stopped now, why it continues and will probably continue until it's decided finally on the battleground.
Yeah, it's always interesting when it comes to the statements that Trump makes. I wonder, is he only getting so much information, right? Are the people that are in his ear telling him one thing? Because he'll come out and he'll act all mad that Russia is, launching a variety of drone and missile strikes into Ukraine. And it's like, yeah, Russia's been telling you that that's exactly what they're going to keep doing. They've said, hey, we're happy to have these talks, but we're going to continue pursuing our goals on the battlefield. That's exactly what they're doing. And it's also been interesting to see. I know that the Wall Street Journal reported over the weekend that the Trump administration has quietly been blocking Kiev's use of long-range strikes on Russia for months now. In reality, the US hasn't been carrying out those strikes because it's not really Kiev that does it. It's very much the US that has to be directly involved. But as we know, obviously, it was those long range strikes that the Biden administration was carrying out that brought us to the brink of World War III late last year. So, I mean, is Trump scaling things back at all, or is this more so just about giving some time for talks? And then there is still the possibility that the Trump administration could come back with these long range strikes if Russia doesn't give them the answer that they want in, X amount of time.
It's hard because I mean Trump can turn on a dime. I mean it's famously his position is the one of the last person he spoke with, and so when he's out golfing with Lindsey Graham, you know it's going to be a pretty bad day for America. So he has this meeting with President Putin, this summit in Alaska, which by all measure went off very well, even if nothing was accomplished. Nothing in quotes, because what was accomplished is two world leaders met respectfully, something Biden would never have done or could never have done. They met respectfully. They seemed to genuinely respect each other, to give each other the due deference that they deserve, and that's a very positive development. But then he had Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs come into the Oval Office, i.e., Zelensky, who's Snow White for more reasons than one,
Yeah.
and the and the Seven Dwarfs were in there, and he got an earful, at least from Zelensky and a couple, and Mertz and a few others, and he started singing a slightly different tune, not completely different. But then he did put out a post on his Truth Social where he seemed to indicate support for Ukrainian offensive strikes deep inside of Russia. So it's really difficult to read him. And I'm just starting to wonder, I think the Russians may have just sort of, in a way, we'll pat him on the head, we'll give him respect, but we know that he can't be taken for his word. He can't be dealt with. So it's a real problem for diplomacy when one side just can't be trusted. And as to your previous question about information, I do seriously think that there are some people who are running interference on information and giving both the president and the vice president, who I would guess is probably more savvy, at least on social media, than the president. Who knows? Though the president certainly does a lot of it. But there was J.D. Vance was interviewed, I think, over the weekend, and he said some things that were just patently untrue that anybody could point to. One of them is that Russia didn't achieve their goals of a regime change in Kiev immediately, which is what they stated. Well, they've never stated that. That's never been a goal. And a few other things he said that just simply weren't true. So it's difficult to end a conflict if you don't understand the nature of a conflict. Neither of them I've ever heard said that this whole thing was Obama's fault, because he's the one who overthrew the government in the first place back in 2014. And it's such an easy, it's an easy shot. It's like 3-pointer. This is why we shouldn't have an interventionist foreign policy, because it comes back to bite us. It's all there teed up for us to kick away, but unfortunately they're never able to square the circle on that.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And it's been interesting too to watch how Trump, even when he's talking about how, he says, I just want people to stop dying, he makes it sound like Russians and Ukrainians are being killed at the same rate, like they're on the same level here. That's not remotely true from everything we've seen. And so I do wonder sometimes if Trump and Vance and, some of the others at the top, what kind of information they're getting. And going to the position that Russia is in, kind of as you were noting there, I know that when we got into the Trump administration, there was almost a little bit of fear that Trump was going to say, okay, you know what? I'm done arming Ukraine. I'm done supporting this war. Give Russia what they want. And then Russia was going to agree to some sort of a deal. Then at some point, it was going to become some sort of Minsk style deal where then we just keep doing the same thing over and over again. How do you view the position that Russia's in right now, as Trump has already shown that he can't be trusted, whether you're Hamas, whether you're Iran, anyone who has talked to Trump or tried to make a deal with him has had issues at some point. So Russia's not alone here, but at the same time, they also were kind of in this position of trying to continue to carry out talks while still very much focusing on the battlefield.
Well, I mean, I think chief among the misplaced presumptions about this war is that Russia would somehow put down its weapons and stop firing. I mean, I don't know that there's ever been a war in history when the side that's winning all of a sudden decides to stop before its goals are met. And the presumption that they would do that strikes me as naive in the extreme. And that is also a product, as you mentioned, that's a product of believing the propaganda that's being fed to the president. Oh, Russia's lost 1 million people. Well, we know from the leak in the Ukrainian military database that they've actually lost through KIA, MIA, or desertion upwards of 1.7 million people. We also know the latest exchange of bodies were 1,000 on the Kiev side, and I think it was 19 on the Russian side. So by every observable metric, Russia is completely dominating in this war and closer to meet its goals. So why would they give up now? As you correctly stated, Rachel, why would they go for Minsk 3, take a pause and allow the West, and even if the U.S. didn't do it, we know the Europeans would do it, allow the Europeans to restock the cupboards with full of nice goodies, nice weapons, and let it get started again and let more Russians die. In fact, if the U.S. wanted Putin to be ousted from office, that's probably the quickest way to do it. To have him fall for another Minsk agreement would have people that are to his right, which is the real opposition in Russia, would start getting, I think, very restless.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. And, as we're kind of watching what the US is doing now and the way that they are handling this, you've got Europe in this position, as you were noting earlier, right? The seven dwarves come flocking to Washington. They've got to be there with their Snow White Zelensky. And all of a sudden, we start getting this talk, maybe renewed talk about security guarantees, right? Because Europe's at the forefront. They want to put troops on the ground in Ukraine. If Russia wasn't hearing any red flags from the US with everything that they were saying, they're certainly hearing red flags here with Europe literally telling them, if you give us a pause, we're going to put troops on the ground. So, how do you view the role that Europe is playing as the US is kind of in this position where they're like, hey, we're going to find this off ramp over here. We're going to act like we just want to see peace. Hey, Europe, you deal with this proxy war with Russia while we focus on, whatever other war of the moment we want to focus on.
Well, Europe's not going to do anything. They've been all talk from the entire process. What about literally everything that Europe has said that they're going to provide to Ukraine, except for money, they've failed to do. And this is actually another place where J.D. Vance was wrong in the interview. He said that, Russia is showing more flexibility. They've accepted the concept of security guarantees. Well, that was part of the Istanbul talks in 22. The issue, however, is what will be the structure of these guarantees. And from the proposals that was almost signed, tragically not signed, thanks to Boris Johnson, Russia would be one of the guarantors of the security. It would be. I think at the time it was the Security Council members would be. Or unless that's the new one. Nevertheless, the original concept, the original framework was that Russia would also be one of the security guarantors, and thus would have a veto over sending 3 or 4 dopey, British soldiers over there with no guns or what have you, or no-fly zones. So the idea that Russia would sit down and say, okay, well, you guys can go ahead and put some troops in there, and you can fly some F-15s, F-16s. You can, you can do all this, and that's fine with us. No, and I think to really underscore that no was when Russia bombed the at least American involved factory near the border of Hungary, among the furthest west Russia has ever reached, and it completely obliterated this factory that was reportedly making components for the drone program for Ukraine. I don't think the timing was coincidental. The point is, if you come here and you start aiding the Ukrainian military machine, you will die, you will get blown up.
Yeah, a very important lesson that NATO needs to pay attention to, right? Especially all of these countries in Europe that want to be so quick to throw troops out there, looking at, say, France and Germany. Now, while I have you here, I do also want to ask you about another important conflict that we're following, which is the ongoing genocide that Israel and really the US, I include the US in there fully, are carrying out, targeting the Palestinians. And you've got Israel with yet another massacre that they carried out on Monday as they bombed the Nasser hospital in southern Gaza, not once, but twice, killing rescue workers, journalists, and hospital staff. And the Trump administration, again, they want to take this hands-off approach, right? They want to act like, oh, we didn't know that was going to happen. That's just Israel. What can we say? We give them the weapons, and how they use them is completely up to them. But how do you view really the state of this genocide and the United States' direct role in it?
I mean, what would you say to the judge? You know your neighbor is a homicidal maniac, and you give him a bunch of weapons and he goes to kill someone. You're going to get hit with charges, And so how could that not be the case with the U.S.? And you better believe it that if that video hadn't been shot of that horrific double tap, the second strike, we would probably have heard very little about it. And the Israelis wouldn't have had to issue a rare oops. They would have said, oh, they were all Hamas. But the fact is, and it's way too slow for those of us who actually are pro-life, But I think America's starting to take notice. There have been certainly polls starting in the spring, including a new poll that came out from the University of Maryland, I think just a couple of days ago, showing a drastic and dramatic shift in American public opinion with regard to Israel and Palestine, especially among younger people, which of course is why they want to ban certain social media that allow younger people to express their concerns about it. But I think the one that came out, I think it was Gallup or Pew that came out a couple of months ago, showing that Republican voters between the ages of 18 and 40 do not support a state of Israel. That's something I never thought I would see in my lifetime. So Israelis' policies is not only destructive to the physical bodies of Palestinians, but it's also destructive to Israel. The U.S. is the last remaining ally of Israel in the world, and tide is turning in the U.S. They should probably start reading the room a little bit better, because they're in for some serious peril, including divisions within Israel itself.
Yeah, and especially when you have the fact that, as you were pointing out there, you have this video, right? You're watching a live stream genocide, one war crime at a time. You're getting on a platform like X and you're seeing all of these different images and videos showing you how horrific this is. And I know that for someone like Trump, he's, kind of come up into this political world where it is expected that you will support Israel, and that, he took his $100 million from Miriam Adelson and he's like, okay, I'm going to do what I'm told to do. Here's the cabinet members you want. Let's go on business as usual. But now we're starting to see that tide turning. And then you also have the fact that, Trump is someone, and I know they all do this, they campaign on this promise, we're going to end the endless wars, no new wars, so on and so forth. And then they get into office and they do the opposite. But for Trump, now he's in this position where he's still supporting the proxy war against Russia, still supporting genocide in Palestine. Oh, and he's already attacked Iran. He's got warships off the coast of Venezuela. And then he's planning for war with China. And we're not even into his full first year of this second term. So what does that tell us about the U.S. foreign policy, where it stands under the Trump administration, and really what we could be in for in just the next 3.5 years?
And don't forget, we lost a war with Yemen. The stakes became too high. When you have two carrier groups and you have F-35s mysteriously falling off of carriers, and you hightail it out of there, so we can't. The U.S. is not able to take the kinds of casualties in terms of humans or its material. Look what happened in the 12-day Israeli war against Iran, which was, of course, a sneak attack, as we both know. As everyone knows, the United States used about 20% of its THAAD missiles just to backstop Israel's attack on Iran. Now, people that are facing, $1.5 trillion a year military budget, they're going to start wondering, well, hey, what are we getting for all that money? We don't seem to have any weapons, and the ones we have aren't working very well, and you're starting to see the man behind the screen. You're starting to see that the whole thing is a house of cards, and starting to crumble. It was a way of taking money from working Americans and transferring it to the elites around the Beltway in Washington, D.C., to build massive mansions for themselves and to fleece the American people under the guise of, we're keeping you safe, which, of course, they're doing the opposite by saber rattling. So I think the scam is being exposed, Rachel, and I think what's so important is that they're losing a major component, and I'm talking about the conservative side. They're losing a major component. Now, they're starting to lose a little bit from Congress. Marjorie Taylor Greene has taken some very brave stands on this, but they're losing journalists. They're losing people like Tucker Carlson, who is extraordinarily popular and powerful. And they have people like yourself, who, if I may presume, are not coming from the left, who are critical of these foreign policy issues. And there are so many of them that are emerging now that they can't even keep control of the narrative that's slipping away from them. So I think they're going to start seeing, and it's going to happen probably on Capitol Hill somewhat sooner than later. They're going to start seeing that this is a liability politically. Now, members of Congress, they absolutely have fealty to Israel, but the only thing that comes before Israel for them is not America, but it's their actual seats. So if they start thinking that they might lose a seat, they're going to start rethinking, they're going to start mincing their words a little bit on the Middle East. It shows them to be cowards, but nevertheless, for those of us who really do hate the killing, I'll take it.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And it's interesting because watching this too, I usually say I'm somewhere in the middle, right? Not too much to the left, not to the right, but
I'm sorry to
you
be
watch it all.
presumptuous.
No, you're good. You watch us all because I know a lot of people really got on board with the Trump train the second time around, exactly as they did the first time, and said, oh, hey, he's going to be different this time. And so it has been kind of fascinating to watch because I've never been necessarily just anti-Trump or pro-Trump. I'm just like, hey, I would love to see the guy do, maybe some of what he campaigned on when it comes to foreign policy. Unfortunately, a lot of that we don't get when it comes to actually being anti-war. But we're 7 months into his second term, and he's in the Oval Office on Monday telling reporters that, oh, we should rename the Department of Defense to the Department of War. I know it was previously the name for it, but he's like, I like that name much better. He's referring to Pete Hegseth as his Secretary of War. And then the one other story that I wanted to mention here, because I know that the US government recently acquired, according to reports, 10% of Intel stock in a roughly $9 billion deal. Now you have Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick telling CNBC on Tuesday that the Trump administration is thinking about whether the US should acquire equity stakes in top defense contractors such as Lockheed Martin. I mean, wouldn't that be a massive conflict of interest in an area that is already a conflict of interest for all of these endless wars that the US government continues to support?
I think it's a very dangerous development. It's this move toward corporatism, is one step before the F word, and the F word is the one that Benito Mussolini represented, but we're there with corporatism. And you're absolutely correct when it comes to conflicts of interest, because now Russia's military industrial sector, as I understand, is for the most part state owned. But they're driven by a different foreign policy than the U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. foreign policy is still driven by this idea that we have to maintain a global military empire. And so when you have that, and then you have the structures that make that happen, partially owned by government. Well, if the government owns a stake in Lockheed, and all of a sudden we stop the wars, well, then the government's going to start losing money, so they're going to have to gin up more wars. It's very dangerous. I mean, it does start with the policy. If we could change our foreign policy, I don't necessarily think that it's a terrible idea to look at the military sector as something that should not be a for-profit sector. And we have the worst of both worlds in our military-industrial complex, because you and I are forced to be taxed to pay for the research and development of these weapons, and then the companies that get off scot-free with the research and development then go sell them overseas and make more profits. So we kind of get it both ways. But I think there would be room for some sort of reform as to the way we create our weapons, and we create the things that we need to defend the country. But what we're doing now is going to make things much, much worse. And I think it's just a very dangerous turn for the United States to take.
Yeah, and we're so early on into Trump's second term. I'm curious to see and almost hesitant to see where we go from here. I know that there is certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Daniel McAdams, Executive Director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity and co-host of the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you, Rachel.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.